and welcome to the Substance Use Prevention Fundamental Series, offered by ADAPT, which stands for Division for Advancing Prevention and Treatment. It's a new division housed in the University of Baltimore's Center for Drug Policy and Prevention. We're excited to have you here today. This is our third technical webinar, and this is a technical webinar series that we'll be offering, and this will be going on for at least the next few months. Today, we're excited to launch a technical webinar on risk factors, and I'm joined today by Dr. Diana Fishbein, who is a direct partner in helping to deliver these technical webinars to you. She's the president and the co-director of the National Prevention Science Coalition. You're going to hear a little bit more about her later on, but I wanted to just highlight the fact that she's been extremely instrumental in connecting us with subject matter experts for this series. The series is designed to break down these fundamental concepts of substance use prevention, and the way that we approach that from ADAPT and have worked with all of our presenters on presenting the content is really from a lens of translation. And the way we approach translation is by breaking down the concepts into relatable, and that means relatable in language and relatable in experience, and digestible content. So the digestible content really represents the ability to break down the different pieces of information embedded within a concept into small enough pieces that you can readily absorb it, and then immediately apply it once it's been synthesized with the other pieces. So welcome. We're excited to have you here today. This will be a pair of technical webinars. The other webinar that will be offered on April 8th is the Protective Factors webinar, and it will be a sister to this particular one. You can find a resource supplement underneath your Event Resources tab at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And as always, this Event Resources supplement is really designed to provide you with additional resources that have been recommended by Dr. Fishbein, our presenter, as well as the ADAPT team, who has done a lot of work in this space. And I just want to leave you with one of the reasons that we are offering this particular concept today, a technical webinar on this concept, is because we've been doing a lot of technical assistance with individual HIDA communities across the nation. And this is one topic that consistently comes up, and people have reported that they are genuinely interested in learning more about it. They are funding, HIDA's funding, and multiple communities are funding obviously a wide variety of programs that address risk factors for substance use. And so this is why we are bringing this to you today. I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Patty Versizidis, who is our Assistant Director for ADAPT. Welcome, and we hope you enjoy the webinar today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. As you'll see on your screen is a screenshot of an example of the audience interface, and this is what it should look like on your own computer desktop. We would just like to draw your attention to two areas on the screen. First, you'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to Dr. Fishbein by typing your questions into the Ask a Question pane that's located beneath the presenter's image. You can send these questions in at any time, and we'll be stopping a few times along the webinar today to go ahead and start addressing those. We highly encourage thoughts, questions, reactions to be sent to us that way so that we can engage with you. Also, as previously mentioned, right below the Ask a Question pane is the Event Resources pane. So this is where you'll be able to hit the little downward arrow to unfold the resource supplement that's made available to you today. A quick note for the completion of the webinar. So at the very end of the webinar, you'll receive an automated post-presentation survey that will pop up onto your screen that allows you to provide any feedback on today's webinar event. Once you complete that, that will automatically trigger an email to be sent to you with a certificate of participation for today's event. Lastly, just please note that you're only in listening only mode today on your computer speaker system. There's not a dial-in option available for the webinar. Should you encounter any technical difficulties today, we have two contact information points for you on the slides. One is for GoToWebcast admin support, and the other is you can also reach ADAPT at the email provided on the slide. So now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Diana Fishbein. Dr. Fishbein is the director of the Translational Neuroprevention Research at FPG Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's also a part-time senior research faculty at Pennsylvania State University and holds positions as adjunct professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Johns Hopkins University, and the University of California, Irvine, as well as a faculty subcontractor at Georgetown University and a guest researcher at the National Institute on Drug Abuse's intramural research program. Dr. Fishbein's studies use transdisciplinary methods and a developmental approach to understanding interactions between neurobiological processes and environmental factors. Her research really supports the premise that underlying neurobiological mechanisms interact with the quality of our psychosocial experiences and environmental context to help alter trajectories either towards or away from risk behaviors. Her work also suggests that compensatory mechanisms can be strengthened with the appropriate psychosocial and environmental manipulations and interventions. Dr. Fishbein has published extensively and serves in an advisory capacity for federal and state government bodies, as well as several universities and organizations. And given the inherent translational nature of her research, she founded and directs the National Prevention Science Coalition for Improving Lives, also known as NPSC, which is a national organization dedicated to the transfer of knowledge from the basic sciences to practices in real-world settings and public health policies, and is also a partner on this webinar series. Welcome, Dr. Fishbein.
Thank you so much, Patty and Laura. Really looking forward to talking with you all today about risk factors. It sounds like gloom and doom to talk about risk factors, but later on we'll be talking in another webinar about protective factors. So there is another half of the equation, but it's very important that we discuss risk factors and have a better understanding so that we know how to intervene. I want to start really by recognizing what's happening in these times with the pandemic and the recognition of the adverse impacts that are very disparate as a result of the pandemic. But many of these disparities have existed for maybe hundreds of years and need to be addressed. And the pandemic just caused them to bubble up to the surface for everybody to see. One of the realizations about all of this is that, the value of prevention science and what prevention has to say about how to address the pandemic itself in terms of the spread of the virus, but also in terms of the disparities that we really need to address that contribute to problems, including substance use disorders. So until now, most people did not understand what prevention is or that there is a science to it. But now we have a much better understanding, and it really emphasizes the need to use proactive approaches. So prevention is not just about disease management. It's about nurturing healthy child development and developing and supporting strong families and communities and a strong social fabric. So that's what we're really focusing on more so now, because people are really recognizing it and embracing it. So this is just what I call the run of the show. We're going to talk about a public health model. So we're going to see risk factors through this lens, and that's what we're going to start with. And then we're going to get into what do we know? What is the state of prevention science? And use a model for understanding what the impacts are of the environment, which is where many of the risk factors reside, on child and adolescent development, and where the opportunities are for intervention. So we know that, also substance use disorder is developmental. So it doesn't just all of a sudden arise. It just doesn't emerge all of a sudden unexpectedly. There's usually a litany of things that a child or an adolescent has experienced previously that have accumulated and led to the emergence of a substance use disorder. And we're going to then, so we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about normative development and what that looks like, and then how risk factors impact on our development to increase the risk for substance use. And because adversity and inequality are at the root of many of these problems, I am going to focus on that quite a bit. And again, bring back in the developmental aspects of these exposures. And then we'll talk about some practical implications for intervention and for policy. So we're going to start with a quiz. So we're going to do a pre and post survey. And if you would, and I believe you can see this on your screen, is to identify what type. So just pick out the single most influential type of risk factor that you think is the most influential in predicting substance use disorder in adolescence. So I'm going to give, 10 or 15 seconds for you to select your choice. And then we'll do a post survey and see if there's any convergence.
So Dr. Fishbein, all of the results are in.
Excellent. Okay. So let's see what we have. We have, let's see, adverse experiences. Adverse experiences is really come out on top. Family dysfunction is next. Deviant peers, behavioral and conduct problems and mental illness. A little bit of genetic susceptibility in there. It's still changing. People are still apparently being polled. But so this is very interesting. And I think my job is done here because that's very, very good responses. Okay, thank you for that. And we'll go back. We'll see if there are any changes in your perceptions. So, as I said, we're going to start with a public health model. And this is a parable. And we're going to watch the video first, and then I'm going to come back to it to put it into the context of preventing risk factors. Okay. Okay, I think we're good. So I'm anxious to hear what you all think of that. But this is a parable that has been around for decades, and it describes, really the upstream. It's an upstream analogy that describes primary prevention, which is a key concept in public health approaches. And by focusing on primary prevention, public health consists of a population level effort to prevent harm or damage or disease. So starting down here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the triage part of the stream, we have mostly reactive strategies. Here we have really what is more about problem management, chronic problem management. So it's when already problems have arisen, and we have a focus on what we call deep enders. Many of you may have heard that expression. I don't particularly care for it, but it really indicates that somebody's in trouble, somebody needs treatment, or it's even, by the time they get into the juvenile justice, the criminal justice system. So we need to do this because we miss a lot of people that are falling into the river, but we need not to have this as our sole focus. So at the inoculation, a little bit up the upstream, we are looking here more at at-risk populations. So here is where we want to modify individual behavior or the prevailing conditions. So we might be focusing on conduct problems or early stage drug use initiation, or kids that are at risk of dropping out of high school. We may also be looking at violence control in a community. We might be looking at poor maternal health and improving that, or parenting supports. So that's the inoculation stage. A little bit further up the river, we have the promotion of resilience. And this is, we're getting there, but this is where we want to deliver programs very systematically, very systematic delivery of evidence-based programs. We also want people to be aware and educated about the risk factors that contribute to these problems. We want to encourage adoption of these programs so that they are embedded in systems that existing infrastructures in our society. And we want to change mindsets so that people understand the really critical value of prevention. So, for example, we might want to strengthen social competency skills and coping skills and that sort of thing, and look for solutions when problems begin to arise before they become entrenched, and build supports into communities, and systems. Now, up here, under normalizing prevention, this is a real population level approach where we recognize what the social determinants of health are. And we build in the conditions. We look at the conditions in which people are born, where they live, where they work, where they play, across the lifespan. And we are essentially reducing exposures to detrimental conditions at the outset. So here's where we build the bridge. So we make sure that nobody is falling into the river. So what is behind the science of prevention? Prevention essentially wants to disrupt pathways to negative outcomes. So we want to find critical windows of opportunity to intervene in external conditions or conditions in which children and families are living so that we can improve them. So ultimately we have improvements in health and well-being of individuals, and we're able to strengthen the ability of communities to support them. So with respect to what prevention scientists do, there's basically 4 things. The first is to identify risks that can be reduced and protective factors that can be strengthened. Today, we're going to talk primarily about the risk factors because you'll get the other information in other webinars provided by ADAPT. Here we also assess the effectiveness of programs and policies to determine how well they work. And that leads to the third one, which is determining what works best and how best to implement and scale them. And then developing an optimal means for dissemination and diffusion of that knowledge. And it's at this point where really the rubber meets the road, where we are really focusing on what the end users need. What do they need to know in order to ensure they're doing their part in terms of prevention? And the end users are many of you in this webinar. They're practitioners and they're treatment providers, clinicians, and their community stakeholders and their policymakers. So all across the board, it's important for folks to know this information. So essentially, what have we learned? We've learned what the risk factors are that exert an impact throughout child and adolescent development. And I say here across a number of domains, because we might be trying to prevent substance use, but the risk factors that children experience lead to a whole host of problems if they are not addressed. Everything from academic failure to chronic disease in adulthood. We also have learned that the problems that underlie risky behavior revolve around self-regulation. So psychopathology, behavioral disorders, all of them are underserved by self-regulation, problems with regulating behavior and emotion. And I'm going to talk about how adversity, stress, and trauma are the root causes of this and how they impact the ability to regulate behavior and emotion. So adversity, stress, and trauma are at the base of everything that concerns us. So we'll focus on that a lot, which is why your poll was already right on. So both the risk factors themselves, for example, the environment, that could be one risk factor, and their negative impacts on individual functioning, which could be the dysregulation. So you could fill in a lot of things here in the blanks. They are preventable. We know they are preventable if they are appropriately addressed. So what's exciting right now is that the field of prevention science is being informed by research that's going on having to do with the brain and how it develops. And so we have discovered that the systems in the brain to regulate behavior and emotion that are critical to adolescent success actually have to develop before the age of 11. And we're talking the building blocks. So the brain regulatory systems that undergird adolescent success have to develop before the age of 11. And we know the brain is plastic. And this is sort of a for better or for worse equation. The brain is plastic in a good way, in that it shows what we've learned from neuroscience is that nurturing caregivers and nurturing environments actually improve the way the brain develops and the way it functions ultimately throughout the life course. And we have actually identified some of the neural structures and networks that support healthy attachment, socialization, adaptive learning, and yes, self-regulation. So we know what these neural systems are, and we're beginning to be able to see what is working to support these systems. And then in the for worse part of the equation, we're starting to see what happens when these systems don't develop well, primarily because of the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the brain, which have implications for how our behavior is regulated and our well-being throughout the life course. So brain plasticity is good if you have nurturing conditions, and it's not so good if you have ACEs because of the impact on the brain. But going back to the lighter side of the equation, if you have developmentally timed evidence-based strategies that we can provide systematically to individuals and, in our community and governing systems, they have the potential to enhance neural maturation. In other words, evidence-based strategies we're beginning to find out actually change the way the brain is rewired and can improve or even accelerate neurodevelopment. And this is particularly true for children who are disadvantaged. And there is potential for all of this to have a long-standing impact into adulthood for functioning and for well-being. And I just want to show you this, and then I'm going to ask how everybody's doing. This is just one example that I thought was kind of fun, unless you're allergic to spiders, and then it might give you the willies. But this is some research that's being done that uses populations that are phobic to spiders. And these are adults, and these two images are of numbers of people. So they're aggregated images that have been averaged, and they all have a spider phobia. And when you show them in the scanner a picture of spiders, their parahippocampal gyrus lights up. And that's where this red arrow is, because that's where they are experiencing fear and threat. And I got to get out of here kind of emotion. And it's feeding back up to the front of the brain to say, to initiate that fight, flight, and fright kind of reaction. And so this is what happens when you have a spider phobia. But after several weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy, they look again at the spiders and it's not lit up. And so what that means to me, and I think to you, is that with the right therapy, that if adults can change, can you just imagine the extent to which we can help children who are experiencing post-traumatic stress or other kinds of, inputs that are adverse and that are affecting their ability to function in school and at home and in social situations. So there's so much potential because children are much more plastic than adults. So let me ask if there are any questions at this time.
Yes, there are a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is really asking your opinion, if you agree or disagree with this statement. The viewer had been really tuning in to your discussion of ACEs and focused on parenting as a natural mitigation strategy. His or her question is, perhaps national parenting education campaigns akin to the smoking and seatbelt campaigns of the past could be an example of this, but perhaps national multimedia messaging that teaches parenting behaviors and practices generally recognized as supporting the healthy development of children might be a good idea. Do you agree or disagree, Dr. Fishbein?
I 100% agree. What we need to be careful of is not to tell parents that we want to improve their ability to parent or say anything that would diminish their feelings of efficacy in their own parenting abilities. But if we can provide education to support parents in providing nurturing parenting techniques and so forth, then I think we're in really good stead. I personally feel that we should teach good parenting skills that have been really well researched and known to be effective and lead to good well-being in children. I think they should be taught in middle school before people have children. And maybe that would enable children to realize that you need to wait till they're more mature to have their own children. But I think it's very important to have these kinds of campaigns, again, not diminishing individual skills and their feelings of efficacy in stating them, but rather to provide support. So, and I think, all these sorts of public education campaigns for a number of purposes would be very helpful to people generally and to saturate the media in that way. So I'm very in favor of that.
Thank you. We have two additional questions that have come in. The first is, from a prevention perspective, can you differentiate in that video that was, and I do want to actually mention real quick, if you did not see the video, we did share the link in the Q&A, so please look down there for the link to that. Can you differentiate in that video between building a fence, more of an external influence, and changing choices, more of an internal influence, of people regarding going to the edge to watch?
Oh, oh my. That is a very complex question. It may only be one sentence, but going to the edge to watch, there's, certainly evolutionary reasons why people are kind of drawn to watching things that are not pleasant or that actually get your adrenaline going, people watching accidents on the side of the road and stuff like that. It just reminds me of that. But I think what probably is more important is in a public health approach, we don't just watch, we act. and we're proactive in doing so, so that we all need to have the mindset that embraces the principles of prevention, and that we act on them in our daily lives, in our interactions with others and with our young ones, so that we can bring out the best in people. But we also need to be aware of the kinds of things that can cause people to fall into the water, and not just watch as they go downstream, but act. And so, it's difficult to change minds and hearts. But I think with, more of a steady stream of education and understanding, that we can eventually change attitudes and behaviors in that regard. So I hope that was a useful answer, because like I said, it's complex.
Thank you. And then the last topic you discussed was neuroplasticity. And one viewer is asking, what are some methods that they can think about to help with building neuroplasticity?
I am hoping to talk about that. So if I don't, please bring it up again in the next Q&A, but I do plan to talk about just that. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the risk factors. I'm going to mention them as a framing kind of message to you, but then we're going to talk about normative development and then get back to adversity and other risk factors. So this is a test for substance use disorder. And I'm not asking you to take it, of course, but I just wanted to point out that all the major risk factors are in these 10 questions. And I'll just roll through them. Family history of substance abuse in a close relative, easily accessible drugs and alcohol that are in their environments, that are being offered or are around them, friends or family that use drugs or alcohol. I use them in front of them and use them frequently. Do they grow up in an area of poverty or low socioeconomic status? That's a very big risk factor. Do they have a history of trauma, childhood trauma? Were their parents rarely around and not provide enough supervision and be involved in their lives? Is there a history of mental illness, either budding in childhood, coming out in adolescence, or even in adulthood, where you have full-blown depression, anxiety, and that sort of thing? Post-traumatic stress disorder, as you'll hear later, is very, very much associated with substance use, and I should say addiction. Are they experiencing a significant transition in their lives? So in children, are they experiencing, a contentious divorce in their parents, the loss of a parent or a loved one, the loss of a job in someone who's older, or changing schools, are all very stressful? Did the individual start using drugs or alcohol before they were a teenager? So early onset is a very well-known risk factor for early substance use disorder in adolescence. Okay. So these are some of the influences in our lives. They are in all our lives, but I'm going to put them into the context of substance use as we go along in this presentation. So we have distal influences, which are sort of in our prevailing environment. They might not necessarily be in our home, but they're around us. So, they live in an impoverished neighborhood, or is there access to health care? That's the income and resources one. In social cohesion, we're talking about pro-social norms and connectedness and discrimination. Is there discrimination in the community? And then with the physical environment, is there decay? So, a lot of this has to do with design of an environment around them. Are there toxic metal exposures? What about media? What kind of media are they being exposed to and saturated with? So those are the distal influences. These are some of the proximal influences that, and this is true, again, for all of us. The proximal influences are within, our proximity, in other words. So our family, how involved they are, what kind of discipline they receive, etc. School, is there a high quality education? Do they attend school? Is there a positive school climate? Are there activities within their schools? And then finally, peers. Pro-social peers, exposure to alcohol, social networking, etc. So those are in that bucket, if you will. Together, these distal and proximal influences have an effect on the way our brain grows, as I said before, and our ability to regulate emotion and behavior. So all of these things impact on what's happening with our brain in terms of our language development, our ability to be attentive, problem solving, delay of gratification, and so forth, are all undergirded by structures in the brain. Are they growing properly? What's these influences look like to, lead to these kinds of outcomes, these intermediate outcomes, if you will. And then emotion regulation, what's stress reactivity, what's coping look like, perception of emotion, and physiological stress responses. So together, these things mediate what your primary outcomes look like. What is academic performance? How well are they doing? Okay. What's their level of social and emotional competence? What does their behavioral and psychological status look like? What kinds of problems are they manifesting? And then, as I mentioned before, physical health is very much part of this equation, because these things, if they've gone awry, can lead to chronic disease outcomes later in adulthood. So the developmental pathways, you can see all of these influences have an effect on whether from infancy to early adulthood, if all of these things are in place. These developmental milestones have to be met in order to prevent behavioral and mental health problems, including substance abuse. So all of these things have to be intact, if you will, during the developmental course. And the systems that undergird them, I keep saying that, I know, but these, the brain systems, the structures and the functions themselves need to have developed properly for adolescents to be successful before the age of 11. And again, age of 11 is very important, that these systems that control emotion, that control regulation of sleep and stress response, that they're functioning well enough to be successful in adolescence, so that you don't end up with a substance use disorder. Now, I'm going to roll through these very quickly, but just to say, these things need to be in place in infancy, right? Caregivers who are responsive, surroundings that provide stimulation, easy to soothe is a temperamental kind of trait that is, pretends a good outcome. Same thing in childhood. Now we're getting more complex in what is needed, but these are the kinds of factors that are predictive of later social competence, if you can get through early adulthood and learn these skills. And then in middle childhood, now we're starting to see the emergence of executive cognitive function and emotion regulation. Executive cognitive function is the front of the brain. I'll show you in a sec. It's the front of the brain, higher order cognitive skills to maintain attention, to be able to communicate and accurately perceive emotion. That's middle childhood. We've already got the building blocks going on for cognition and emotion regulation. So by the time you get to adolescence, the skills are in place for the regulation of emotion and behavior to be prepared for adulthood. And these are the sorts of skills, mostly executive cognitive skills, that are very important to be in place. So a lot of people say to me, because I've been in the field for a really long time before we didn't study adolescence, because people thought it was too complicated because of all the hormones and such variability in the way adolescents develop. But then we realized, and I certainly realized, that adolescence is the most exciting time of life after you have matured through it, and if you don't have one as a child. But it's a very exciting time for researchers, because the brain is literally remodeled in adolescence. And that's why I kept saying before age 11, those things need to be in place, because now there's remodeling and you need to have the scaffolding there in order for it to be remodeled appropriately. So it's during adolescence that the activation within the prefrontal cortex, which is the orange part of the brain that you see here, becomes more focused and more efficient. And there's more of a division of labor throughout the prefrontal cortex. So that's happening. And at the same time, it's becoming increasingly organized and starting to communicate with lower parts of the brain, like the yellow part, which is in the limbic system. And so what's happening here is that we're starting to get more cognitive control over emotional responses. And yes, I know adolescents are still highly emotional. All this isn't together yet. It's not all together, but this is the time when these very vital things need to happen in adolescence. And just on the aside, what substance use researchers say is that kids that start to use heavily marijuana or any other drug, psychoactive drug, if they start to use heavily in adolescence, they become stalled at that developmental period, because some of these things that are developing between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system aren't progressing, and they stall, and they're not fully developing this cognitive tamping down over emotional responses. These are some of the executive functions that we're referring to when I say, they're controlled by the prefrontal cortex, self-control, organization, working memory, and so forth. And these are the executive functions that have a say-so over these lower systems that you see in the limbic system. So the limbic system is about emotion, and the front of the brain needs to tell the limbic system to tamp it down, so that we have good control. So, and the development of executive functions is really protracted. So people say, well, adolescence magically improves, or you're through it at age 18. Well, that is just not the case. In fact, adolescence from a neurobiological perspective doesn't end until you're in the late 20s. So I'm always telling my children, you can't do that because your prefrontal cortex is not yet attached. But this is actually a neurobiological reality. So what I'm going to do here is that we're going to watch a 3-minute video from Larry Steinberg, my friend at Temple University, who is one of the premier experts in this area. So Patty, if we can show that, I think you'll enjoy hearing about teenagers and their brains. So I hope you enjoyed that. I thought it would be interesting to see somebody in a scanner and learn more about what is developing and during this this period of adolescence, which it gets a bad rap, but it's really actually an exciting time and a real opportunity to intervene. Many people ask, well, isn't it too late? Isn't the behavior already entrenched in adolescence? But the point of all of this is that you can see that it's not at all too late. There's so much plasticity and malleability in the period of adolescence that this is a really great time to intervene. Certainly earlier the better, but it's never too late. So I want to just make note here that this is normative. These are all normative changes. It says, why do most 16-year-olds drive like they're missing a part of their brain? Because their prefrontal cortex isn't yet fully developed. So now I'm going to ask another quiz question. Do you believe that after adolescence, people are more or less who they are going to be for the rest of their lives? Yes or no? Oh, it's interesting. It's fluctuating as more people chime in. Huh? Now it's reversed course. We're probably close to being done. Oh, this is so interesting. So we have 46.7% who say yes and 53.3% who say no. So that suggests it's almost 50-50. So it's very, very interesting. We'll talk a little bit about that in terms of, how far along are people in adolescence in going to the next stage of their lives. And this will speak to this a little bit. And I'm going to make some generalizations about adolescence because I think it's important before we move forward. And I say these things given the knowledge that drug use and escalation to abuse almost always happens during adolescence. So once they start, is it a lost cause? I did want to say, first and foremost, adolescents generally do not develop serious psychological or social problems. That is a general rule. Most problems that they do exhibit are transitory. And with respect to drug use, it's just experimentation or, risk-taking that's very experimental, but that does not continue into adulthood. Not all problems begin in adolescence. In fact, some begin in childhood and some do begin later. Although again, with substance use and abuse, it usually occurs in adolescence. And most problems do not persist into adulthood. Serious problems that we do see in adolescence and, in terms of mental health and serious substance abuse are not caused by the normative changes that we've talked about so far. So what happens when conditions are not normative? The signs of poor self-regulation generally are due to the deficits and delays that we see in the way children are developing. And we can see them manifested in younger children with some of those issues that you see here, language delays, negative affect, insensitivity to consequences, and impulsivity in younger children generally start to emerge. And then later, in late childhood and early adolescence, the signs of poor self-regulation are aggressive behavior and novelty seeking and negative affect, poor decision-making, and so forth. And detrimental environmental conditions further compromise the way the brain is developing and increasing risk for substance use disorder. So what conditions can cause this disconnect? I call it a disconnect between these cognitive and emotion systems, between the front of the brain and the lower parts of the brain. These are widely known as the most common and potent vulnerability or risk factors for substance use disorder. And I'll give you a second to look at them. But they fall into these different domains of individual level factors. We have mental health problems, conduct problems, and I will say conduct problems, our research shows, when I say our, I mean the field, not just mine. Conduct problems is one of the very most influential in terms of predicting later substance use disorder. And academic failure. With respect to the environment, and we'll talk about a couple of these, poverty is a very powerful risk factor for substance use. Environmental toxins, lead, cadmium, so forth. Lack of opportunity, homelessness, poor neighborhood conditions, the decay and so forth that we talked about earlier, and the marketing of harmful products. So this is something that we can easily avoid if we are able to better control, the media streams and who's marketing what. Stress and adversity, child maltreatment, isolation, deprivation, racism, discrimination, and inequality. Personal experiences, lack of parental involvement, supervision, social supports. Remember from our quiz earlier on, parental mental illness, parental substance dependence and incarceration, negative peer influences, deviant peers, for instance, or peers that are already using substances, and poorly equipped school systems. And I have down here also substance use itself is a risk factor because once you start using, the risk for escalating is so much greater. This is a little busy, but I love it because it really says it all. Average childhood experiences. These are traumatic events that can have negative lasting effects on health and well-being. And the ACEs survey, which came from a very large study, really go into 3 buckets, but I'm going to give you a reason why we're not just concerned with these 3 buckets, because these 3 buckets are mostly around proximal circumstances that you remember from that matrix. The abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, neglect, household challenges, domestic violence, mental illness, incarcerated parents. These are the 3 buckets that we generally think of. Now, I think it's interesting for you all to know that 67% of the general population has at least one ACE. And I'm sure you're all thinking about what, buckets that you may fall into. We all have, 67%, a third of us, have at least one ACE. How about 4 or more ACEs? When you have 4 or more ACEs, 3 times the level of lung disease, remember chronic disease, and adult smoking. 4 or more ACEs is associated with 11 times the rate of intravenous drug abuse. 4 times as likely to have intercourse by the age of 15. 2 times the level of liver disease. Okay, you can see all this. 14 times more likely to commit or to attempt suicide. So it's very serious. And we see down here on the lower left, people with 6+ ACEs can die 20 years earlier than those who have none. So this is, something that we have to deal with, not only with respect to substance use, but in so many other domains of functioning. But I want to also show you this because what you saw in that previous slide pertain to the trunk and the branches and the leaves on this tree, right? These are the things that are close, the proximal environment. But let's not forget, at the root of the problem is poverty, discrimination, racism. It's community violence. So, I say community matters because we're not only talking about what's going on inside the home or in the proximal environment. So I'm going to ask you another question. Trauma gets under the skin to affect brain development through changes in hormone release, functioning of the heart, psychological state, relationships, none of the above, or all of the above. So let's take another poll and see how that comes out for you all. Oh, okay. All right, now we're getting, I don't know if you can see what I can see, so I'm sorry if I'm, I'm watching as the results come in. They're interesting. So keep them coming. I assume you can still see the poll. Well, I don't see this moving. So I'll go back. Oops, there's a little movement there. Okay, well, I'll go back. I don't want to take too much time, but almost 100% said all of the above. And then several also said psychological state. So I thought that was interesting that you know so much already about how stress affects us, right? Affects all of us. But what about in extreme cases? Quickly. These are also aggregated images. So there's a number of people, number of children in each of these scans, and they are imaged to show the extent to which the brain is connected. Those children without maltreatment that are that have no maltreatment show that they are very, very well connected. And you can see the green is connected throughout the brain. So the green is the front of the brain. And what this means basically is that there's a good amount of top-down control, a lot coming from the prefrontal cortex to tell the rest of the brain what to do. And that's a good thing. But look what happens with children who have been maltreated and how severely, scarce the number of nodes are that are connected to one another. So that's just a really graphic example of what can happen. Interestingly, though, knowing that the brain can be very much affected by stress, what many people don't know is that stress actually activates and can damage the same brain reward systems. They're actually called reward systems responsible for the positive reinforcing effects of drugs. So in short order, stress, trauma, adversity, and so forth can delay, can damage, or can even make it hypersensitive, these reward systems, so that when an adolescent begins to try drugs, they experience much more reward than somebody who has not experienced a lot of adversity. And it reinforces ongoing use. So that is the lesson here. So, and when there's also a mental health disorder, poor parenting, family dysfunction, and so forth, then that relationship is even stronger. So the brain reward system that's affected by drugs is damaged by stress and making it even more responsive to drugs. I said previously that I was going to talk about poverty as a distal influence. Poverty, I'm bringing to light because it is such a strong predictor of substance use disorder and other problems. And it's that distal influence. This just describes what there are high rates of in the overall environment, in their prevailing environment. You're aware. You're very aware of this. But what about on a proximal level? What is happening when children live in poverty in the home? When caregivers are stressed, they're less able to attend to the basic needs of the child, and there's more maltreatment. That's number one. Number two is that it reduces the ability for parents to invest in their child's learning and educational opportunities and their ability to grow academically. It compromises the ability to be involved, patient, and responsive and nurturing caregivers. So the caregiving environment tends to be more disorganized and lacking in the kind of support that children need. And lastly, it creates conditions that are stressful for children. It interferes with growth and the ability to respond adaptively to stress. The take home here, and I have this picture here so you can see, that poverty has been shown to decrease the size of structures, hippocampus and the amygdala in children, that help to regulate stress and emotion processing. But the top, poverty, leads to certain experiences, adverse experiences, that can affect the structure and function of the brain, that can be manifested in the inability of cognition to tamp down emotional responses, ending up in behavioral problems such as substance use. So what is the role of mental health in substance use disorders? Also another busy figure, but I will walk you through it, in that a combined 63.8 million adults 18 years and older have had either a substance use disorder or mental illness in the past year. So it's a huge number, and this is an old figure. It's gotten much worse, and with the pandemic, it has really accelerated. 1 in 12 adults has had a substance use disorder, and 1 in 5 adults has had a mental illness in the past year. And about 12% of these adults, which is 7.9 million, experience both. And this is known as having a co-occurring or a comorbid behavioral health disorder. So it is very, very serious. And the links between mental health and substance use can start relatively young. We see internalizing disorders, which are mostly the depression, anxiety, and that sort of thing. And these folks with internalizing disorders as adolescents tend to self-medicate the process. And when they self-medicate, it can actually make the mental health problem worse. With externalizing disorders, you have sort of a reverse kind of situation. You have conduct disorder, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. And the level of arousal in these disorders is related to an insensitivity to consequences and a need for more stimulation. And so they seek out drugs as a way to stimulate themselves. And these folks are problematic because they tend to be resistant to treatment. Okay, so they need additional, much more targeted evidence-based programming. So why do they co-occur in the first place? As I said, self-medication. So the substance use begins as a means to alleviate the symptoms. Also, causal effects. Substance use may increase vulnerability to mental illness. So, it's a reverse situation. Or there are common or correlated causes. So some risk factors previously experienced give rise to both. And here you can see, again, almost 60% of young people with PTSD develop a substance use disorder. And these problems tend to emerge in adolescence, but you can see anxiety problems and behavioral disorders beginning in childhood, even in kindergarten. Children rated high in anxiety and novelty seeking are more likely to get drunk, smoke, and use drugs in adolescence. Okay? So early intervention. And then mood disorders and substance abuse tend to first occur in adolescence. Oh, and if you look at this figure, you can see anxiety starts in childhood and continues to escalate into adolescence. But if you see substance use is the purple line at the bottom, and that starts around age 12 and then begins to escalate. So my post-survey, what type of risk factor, let's see if there's any differences. What type of risk factor do you think is the single most influential in predicting substance use disorder? Genetics, neurobiology, psychological, neighborhood, behavioral, mental illness, family dysfunction, adverse experiences or deviant peers. Let's see what you all have to say. Okay, so if you are not able to see this, and I don't know if you are, I'm going to send the results. I just noticed that there was that option, so I apologize. It appears, let's see, still people coming in.
And Dr. Fishbein, the audience is able to see them as they sort of come in and readjust as well.
Phenomenal. Thank you. Would love to be able to interact with all of you more directly. So it looks, I'm going to go back to slides. Still, most people think adverse experiences. There's still some family dysfunction. There's a little mental illness, there's behavior, and there's a bit of genetic susceptibility. So I want to mention something too, just so that you know this. Alcoholism has been shown to be very heritable. It's a little messier when you get into some of the other disorders, but the genetic part of the equation for alcoholism is really loaded. But that does not mean that you cannot intervene. So this is just a rehash of our primary risk factors. I'm going to slide through this so that I can get to prevention is timeless and leave enough time for us to have an interaction. Even young children can manifest early signs that increase risk. I think that has come across loud and clear. The conditions of the caregiving environment are key determinants of health outcomes. This one is really important. We know how to prevent, monitor, and treat the full range of most individual and environmental problems. And this is what you're going to get a lot more of in Dr. Bigland's webinar, where he talks about protective factors and what interventions help to strengthen those protective factors. But I will just say for now that there are interventions for every period, every time throughout the developmental course that have been shown to be effective in reversing damage and improving ultimate outcomes. And so there's just a huge number of really good evidence-based interventions that have an effect at the individual level. Some of them are family and parenting interventions. Some are school-based interventions, and some in the community. And I also want to say that policy is essential, because we don't want to wait to only intervene when the risk factors have had their way with child development or with adolescent outcomes. We want to reduce the exposure in the first place. So it's very important that not only do we get these interventions to capitalize on the plasticity of child and adolescent development, but that we also are providing intervention at the community level to revitalize them and to reform systems and embed intervention across sectors in our delivery systems. And that we need to be sure at all times that our policies and our interventions are based on the science, and that we work to change mindsets so that people understand why prevention is absolutely key. So, and again, in all cases, an enriched environment, external supports, and high quality education is essential. So I'm going to stop here, and my wonderful people will tell me where to get to the doc to see questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fishbein. I will read out some of the questions for you. We've consolidated some of them.
Okay.
I do want to briefly address a couple that have come up. We've had some questions around if this video will be accessible in the future for people to share with colleagues. And absolutely, we'll be posting this on our ADAPT YouTube channel. The way to get connected with the ADAPT YouTube channel is to download the resource supplement. You have all modes of connection located, I believe, on the second page, maybe the third of that resource supplement. So yes, please get connected with us via social media, but also via email if that is your preferred method. And we will also be distributing the link, the YouTube link for the video, to all of you who are participating today. We have your emails, and we'll be sending that out to you directly as well. Okay, I do want to highlight one thing you said, Dr. Fishbein, at the end. You noted there are interventions. We do have proven strategies that can help at every intersect, at every potential touch point, right, along that prevention continuum. And that is something that ADAPT is very mindful of, and we'll be focusing on moving into our phase 2. Once we're complete with our fundamentals offerings, we'll be focusing on prevention systems and creating that full spectrum prevention system in community. So just a heads up on that, more to come on that later. Thank you for highlighting that we do have interventions and strategies available that are evidence-based. That leads me into our first question. We've had a question come up. You've presented a variety of vulnerability or risk factors, right? Can you speak to the research that's been done to validate those factors?
I'm so sorry, to validate the risk factors. I thought there was more, so I was waiting for more. Yes, there's just literally thousands of papers, published papers on these. And I have to say that we have known what all the primary risk factors are for decades. There's not a lot new. What's new is what the neuroscience tells us about how the risk factors are impacting development and how they can be prevented and reduced, so that children aren't exposed to these risk factors in the first place. But these risk factors have been very, very well validated through multiple trials and manipulations of the risk factors to see if we improve or take away the risk factors, if we reduce exposure, do ultimate outcomes for children and adolescents improve? And yes, in fact, they do. So it's very well established. What I have to say is that we have, to some extent, neglected protective factors, and Dr. Bigland will speak to that. And I don't mean to be the purveyor of all the bad news, but I was tasked with doing risk factors. But we're starting to understand that protective factors aren't just the reverse of risk factors. It's much more complex than that. And we need to act at the level of protective factors to make sure that we're strengthening these environments and ensuring that they're nurturing. So, you can take away some of the risk factors in a negative environment that might be otherwise leading to substance use. But we also have to realize that there are particular ways of interacting with ourselves, between ourselves, between parents and with our children and in our school systems and our communities, that is going to boost healthy development over and above even just eliminating the risk factors. So if anybody wants to contact me, I'm happy to send papers and reviews. There are some in the resource document that might actually be. Here's some, and there's certainly so much more. So I can certainly help to point you towards some of that literature.
Thank you, Dr. Fishbein. And for those of you that might be interested in learning a little bit more about how studies are appraised or how different programs are appraised in terms of their evidence base, we will be delivering a technical webinar on appraising evidence and learning more about what makes a best practice, what makes a promising practice or an emerging practice, and really breaking down randomized controlled trials versus qualitative studies, case studies. And so all that will be in an upcoming webinar. If you connect with ADAPT, you'll be notified immediately when that is available. The next question that's coming in is an interesting one, because we've heard this actually come in from several of our HIDA communities as well. How can we intervene at a school level when there is no parent involvement?
So there are a wealth of school-based interventions available that are phenomenal. The good behavior game, the promoting alternative thinking strategies, There's PBIS that many of you may be familiar with. It's in a lot of school systems across the country. So those are universal, and they benefit everybody. And then, what the hope is that they're benefiting those that are most at risk. And they have good effect sizes. They're, all interventions could use improvement. But when when you're asking when there's no parent, there's no parent in schools. And so there's a number of ways I could approach that question, in that if you're saying there's no parent in the child's life, how can we bolster supports within the school to kind of override the absence of a parent at home? I could take it that way. And there certainly are these school-based interventions that help to really improve child outcomes. You always want the parent involved, and you always want that reinforcement when they go home from the parent that kind of understands what the programs are that are being delivered, and so that they can, mirror them. They can duplicate those practices at home so that they function better. But I have also worked in school systems where a lot of kids, because I've worked in some really high poverty areas where a lot of kids don't have a consistent parent at home. And so it is very challenging. And we try to provide an array of services within the school system so that they have, first and foremost, a safe haven in the schools. And secondly, so that they can learn coping skills and they can learn social competency skills. These are all the things that help to overcome ACEs and social emotional learning skills, that sort of thing, learning how to self-regulate and being rewarded, reinforced for behavior that, is that works well in group settings. That's really important for children to have a better social development. I mean, there's so many elements, so many active ingredients, if you will, of these programs that can help children who are struggling at home. But so I'm not sure exactly if that question was saying, what about school-based interventions because they don't include the home? Or what about children that don't have that home environment? So there's a few ways of taking it. But ideally, in a community, you'll have comprehensive services that hit on a number of different sectors of that child's world. That child's world is the family. So family and parenting intervention, along with school interventions, along with community services and that sort of thing. We always want to embed these things in systems so that they're getting it from all sides, if you will. And it's really just about building an environment that is really able to promote healthy child development.
Thank you, Dr. Fishbein. The next question piggybacks upon that. If you want to target parents, how do you provide large-scale parent education? The parental ability to access resources is always a challenge, as spoken by this particular viewer. And now it seems as though society may be questioning some research-based approaches in terms of what their experience is in their community. What would you suggest? What would you recommend for providing large-scale parent education?
Well, I had mentioned before that I think it's important to provide parenting education very early in life, in middle school, before people have children, because there are some fundamental principles that are important and that are not value-ridden. We want to avoid being judgmental or having any particular practice be associated with somebody's core values, right? But there's certain, again, active ingredients, certain principles of good parenting that we want to get across. And we can, I've said this before, I'm very much in favor of using the media for this purpose, and using the schools early on to get this across. But I think that there are other sectors, in particular, primary care and pediatrics is a great way. It's a great vehicle for getting parenting strategies across. One of the initiatives that we're working on right now is to get interventions actually embedded into pediatric and other primary care settings, so that we can provide these interventions, including parenting interventions and family interventions at that level, even for well-child visits. It's an opportunity. So we have to look at the opportunity. Where do families have points of contact? Pediatrics and primary care is considered to be a relatively neutral ground. Most people trust their doctors and go to them for information, education. So I really think that's an ideal setting. But they can also get it from their schools, right? They can get it from schools. Schools can actually play a role. They tend not to, but I think it's, again, another opportunity for us to get this kind of education out there with direct, teacher-parent interactions, and doesn't have to target anybody, but, just universally providing that kind of education. And there are others, if there's involvement with the child welfare system, if there's involvement with the healthcare system, other aspects of it, or the mental health care system. All these systems are there in our society that are, hypothetically designed to support families and to support healthy development and the success of individuals in those communities. But they're not used to their fullest. So I will say that much, that I think we look at these points of contact and think about how we can embed them. And we are working at the primary care level right now. I'm also personally working with children of addicted caregivers to make sure that as caregivers receive treatment, they also receive parenting and family intervention that's actually embedded into the treatment facility. This is a structural change approach that I think will help children who are experiencing adversity due to their caregivers' substance use disorder, and help them, not only the parent. And it also actually reinforces recovery, these approaches, in the parent.
Thank you. The next question comes in around evolution. What would be the evolutionary reason why stress may alter the effects of drugs in the brain?
Oh gosh, I love that question. When I sometimes think about these evolutionary reasons, just because of my training, like when I mentioned, evolutionarily, we're kind of inclined to look towards accidents. We have a natural curiosity about things that are happening to other people that are untoward. Why the stress system might affect reward systems. I mean, if you think about it, if you think about how drugs of abuse affect the brain, they act in the reward system to stimulate them. These reward systems are there to support natural drives, eating, sex, social interactions even stimulate these natural reward systems in the brain that are there to ensure that we meet our primary needs. And they create pleasure. They're pleasurable, which means we need to continue to do them so that we can, continue to thrive and survive. That's why they're there. But with stress, it activates these systems so that people flee. They get away from things that are unpleasant. But the stress system is involved in that. Drugs activate the stress system, or the reward system, more than natural drives, which is why the brain is hijacked by drugs of abuse, because they are so much more intensively rewarding than normal behavior, than eating, even sex. And so there's a lot more stimulation, and the focus becomes on these secondary drives become primary to get the drug, and people stop taking care of themselves as a result. They stop eating. There's a lot of things that can occur. So our presentation is scheduled to end in 5 minutes, but I can see an alignment between the stress and the reward system naturally due to this, intersection between, going towards something and going away from something that is stressful. And the system has to be tapped for either of those things to happen.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more question, and this is a macro level question that would be good to end on. This particular viewer really appreciated your information that was presented on brain development. And they're asking pretty large scale. If you had to pick a point of influence within a community, understanding that communities do have and play a significant role in reducing risk factors. If you had to pick a point of greatest influence, is there one?
I do believe that one of the most important things that we can do is what we call a cross-sector approach. So I know you're wondering, like, what sector is most important, but I think that if we have scaffolding in multiple areas, across, health systems, across, primary care, across child welfare, and the juvenile justice system, and even law enforcement, all of these systems need to be educated and need to have ways of responding to the observing adversity. When we observe adversity, there has to be, a pipeline for referral. And so, gosh, it's hard for me to pick one. I think schools can be instrumental, and I think we can probably get the biggest bang for the buck immediately if we were to work through schools, because that is a point of contact where all families converge and where we have the ability not only for intervention, but for education at multiple levels, and schools can be very influential in that regard. But I still think a cross-sector approach where we have full systems change that recognizes the impact of adversity on children, adolescents, families, and communities is where we need to go.
Dr. Fishbein, thank you so much for just an extremely informative but a rich webinar on risk factors. I really appreciate it. You and I have a long-standing relationship. I am just so pleased that you are our partner in delivering these technical webinars. I don't think we could have picked a better partner because of your access to all these subject matter experts, and to have you at the helm of this particular webinar. Just know how much we value and appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's your brainchild, and I want to support it in every way I can.
Patty, I'll hand it over to you for concluding remarks.
Thank you again, Dr. Fishbein, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar on risk factors and substance use. If you have any lingering questions that you did not have an opportunity to submit, please email us at adapt@wb.hida.org so that we can get a response to you. Just a quick reminder that once the webinar ends, or you click the small X located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll receive a post-presentation survey. Upon completion of that survey, you will automatically be emailed a link where you can download any certificates of participation for your participation in today's event. Also, we've mentioned this before, but just as a reminder, we will send a follow-up email in the next 24 to 48 hours. And in that email will include all of the appropriate links in order to access the recording for today's webinar. So we look forward to seeing you again on April 8th for our next webinar on protective factors in substance use with Dr. Biglin. The email that I'll send out in a couple of days will include the registration link for that if you've not yet had an opportunity to register. So on behalf of the ADAPT team and Dr. Fishbein, we really want to thank you for your time today and wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.